The diagnosis of atypical anorexia is problematic and even downright dangerous. I'm Sheena. I'm a registered dietitian that has been treating eating disorders for about 10 years. And I want to talk about some of the problems that come up with the diagnosis of atypical anorexia. So, when we're looking at eating disorders, atypical anorexia falls under the category of OSFED. So, what this is other specified feeding and eating disorders. So, here's the thing when it comes to the DSM 5 diagnosis of eating disorders, they are so far off of what eating disorders actually manifest as in a person that they're, almost kind of irrelevant in my professional opinion. So, I want to really invite you to consider a different way of looking at eating disorders, in specific, eating disorders such as atypical anorexia. A lot of times we want to lump these eating disorders into these distinct, tidy fitting categories, which is almost never how an eating disorder actually manifests. So when it comes to thinking about eating disorders, I actually kind of ditched that DSM-5 criteria. Like, great. It's great for billing purposes or whatever, but it's kind of, the point's kind of moot in terms of how an eating disorder actually manifests and how we are going to treat that eating disorder as a professional. So I like to simplify it even further. If an individual is experiencing extreme trauma, guilt, frustration around food or their bodies, there is a problem. And we basically have two types of eating disorders. So ditch those DSM-5 criteria for the purposes of this video. So when we're thinking about eating disorders, I like to think of them in two ways: restrictive, intentionally, and non-restrictive. So our non-restrictive eating disorders are going to be things like ARFID. So that's avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, where it's more about sensory issues typically, and not necessarily wanting to restrict food for moral reasons or in efforts to change the body. And then there's our restrictive eating disorders, which is basically everything else. So when we think about a restrictive eating disorder versus a non-restrictive eating disorder, that can really help to highlight how breaking these eating disorders into subcategories like atypical anorexia can actually be quite harmful. Here's the reason why I hate this diagnosis. It makes it seem like it is a less severe condition than our anorexia nervosa. And that's simply not the case. In fact, people with atypical anorexia can often experience more severe symptoms than somebody with your stereotypical anorexia, and they can have greater health complications than somebody with anorexia. And the reason why is because these individuals often go under the radar. Atypical anorexia is often characterized as having all the behaviors of somebody with anorexia nervosa, such as restrictive eating, potential purging behaviors, extreme guilt and shame around the body, and also lots of fear foods, all of those plethora of eating disorder behaviors that can be quite dangerous, but they typically don't live in an emaciated body. So, an individual that has quote unquote atypical anorexia might have still experienced a very great degree of weight loss and restrictive behavior. But according to things such as our BMI metrics and other health parameters, they might not be showing on the radar. Now, many healthcare professionals and support individuals mistake this for being a less severe form of anorexia. However, it's not. So these individuals often experience greater degrees of weight loss, potentially greater risk of clinical conditions such as renal failure, heart disease, osteoporosis, low blood pressure, and other very dangerous parameters. And the reason why is these individuals are often praised for having their eating disorder. So while these people might be extremely restrictive and their behaviors, such as cutting calories or extreme exercise or other eating disorder behavior, they're going under the radar. most people are actually probably complimenting a person with atypical anorexia on their extreme weight loss, and it's glorified. So that is extraordinarily problematic for the eating disorder, in that it's fostering that eating disorder behavior. But it's also extraordinarily problematic from a health perspective, because these people are experiencing extreme clinical conditions, often sometimes at a greater rate than somebody that loses a significant amount of weight and exists in an emaciated body, because it's going under the radar and it's just not being caught. And so that's one thing that makes this diagnosis incredibly problematic. Another thing is, many insurance companies don't really recognize this as an eating disorder. And so these people might not be able to get appropriate treatment for their very severe and debilitating eating disorder. An untrained professional might not consider the need for this person to weight restore, because they might say, oh, this person is already at a healthy BMI, which that's a bunch of bullshit as well for another discussion day. But they may say this person is at a quote unquote healthy BMI, so there's no need to weight restore. When in fact, that person has lost a substantial amount of weight, their organs are compromised, and they need to weight restore to regain normal function of their body. This can often heighten the desire to increase eating disorder behaviors more and more for these individuals. And really, when we think about those DSM-5 criteria for eating disorders, they're problematic in themselves, because most people with an eating disorder are going to take a look at those, and they're actually, at least for me in my experience with an eating disorder, I use those things as a checklist to make sure that I was, meeting the quota for having an appropriate level of sickness. So I would go down that list and say, okay, I'm extremely restrictive, I'm engaging in this compulsive exercise, so on and so forth. Oh, did I meet the weight criteria? Okay, I didn't. So some days I didn't, some days I did. So I'm fine. I'm fine. I don't have anorexia. And even if a person were to be diagnosed with atypical anorexia, they might see that as being less severe because they don't exist in that stereotypical emaciated body. So we really have to be cognizant of that when we're working with a person with an eating disorder, and also know that atypical anorexia is just anorexia. And also it's actually probably the more typical anorexia, because only about 6% of people with an eating disorder actually live in emaciated bodies.